All right. Hello to class. Today, what we're going to talk about is the writing process, the history of it, what it means, how we got there, what the implications of it are, and this is to support your reading and your assignments for this unit. So my guess is at this point, pretty much everybody has an understanding of the basics of the writing process. However, do you have a sense of why we do it? What are the values behind it? What does the research tell us? And my guess is probably not. It's that's not really taught that often. Moreover, um, I think in the world as it works today with technology and with the kind of constraints that are going on with curriculum in the classroom, my guess is that it's fairly seldom that you get to use the writing process in its complete form. So let's talk about what it is, what it's developed into, and how it got this way. Where did it come from? So to start with, it's important to note that the writing process was a phenomenon that developed after generations, after centuries of the writing being assumed to happen in one particular way. And it's what we now call the product model. And you can see, if we talk about the process model or the writing process, um, it makes sense that we would then discuss the period before as the product model, because it was all about the writing product, not the journey there, but only the end game. And the reason why it was considered really end game focused is the way it was actually taught. There are two essential functions to the way the product model was taught. Number one, it was based on this idea that there were these outcomes that were expected. And the value of what you produced as a writer depended entirely upon whether or not you fulfilled that specific outcome. And there were only a certain set of outcomes, and they were established by people who were understood to be masters. And they created models of appropriate writing in different environments. And your job was only to get to that model. Your job as a writer was to write to that model. In the professional world, this had to do with producing particular kinds of documents. In the educational world, this meant that students were given very specific models to follow, and their job as student writers was to ape or mimic that model as close as possible. Now, mimicry has its role as a starting point, but as an end point, not so much. Moreover, when students would fulfill that model and turn it in, what would happen is that the teacher then would, and the word we don't use anymore, is they would correct it. Not grade it, not assess it, not review it, not evaluate it, not respond to it. They would correct it. Because the idea was that the model is correct. The student work is turned in and doesn't fit that. So you correct it to get it to fit the model. Now, sometimes that correction had to do with its structure or the ideas, and sometimes a lot of the time it just had to do with sentence level and paragraph level structures. Because with the product model, the idea that the student didn't have much to say was built in. The student's own ideas were not a significant part of what writing was thought to be. It was only the student's ability to fulfill a particular standard, to write in a particular way. So what are the underlying assumptions then of the product model? Well, the underlying assumptions are that all knowledge exists outside the student. The student doesn't bring anything into this game, right? The student's experience doesn't matter, the student's ideas don't matter. Knowledge exists outside the student, and the student's job is to get that knowledge. And in the case of writing, the knowledge was this particular style of writing and whether or not you master it. The second underlying assumption is that there is an identifiable right way to write. Today we think of there being a lot of ways to communicate an idea, but that was not the case. There were these very particular modes of writing, and you didn't step outside of those. You step outside of those, do something individual, we don't have time for that. You follow the right way. And the third, the best way to learn to be successful in the product model, under the product model of writing instruction, is to copy texts written by experts. So your job was not to originate your own text, your job was to copy excellent texts. And the fourth underlying assumption is that students don't need feedback during the process. Students only need feedback after they turn it in, right? And this is a model that's still, unfortunately, sadly common, right? The teacher creates an assignment. The teacher hands the assignment to the student. The teacher waits. Then the student completes the assignment, hands the assignment to the teacher, and the teacher grades it. That grading under the product model is like a student being paddled, meaning don't do it again, whack, 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 right? Here's what you did wrong, whack, whack, whack. So there isn't support for writing. It's just here's what you did wrong. Not here's what you did right and here's how you take it to the next level. It's just here's what you did wrong. And finally, a key underlying assumption to the product model is that improvement happens at the language level, the sentence level, the mechanics level. Style is first. Son, you don't have something to say. You worry about being able to put a decent sentence together. After you can put a decent sentence together, then you can have something to say. That's the product model. It completely disregards anything the student has to bring to the table. So why did we leave the product model? I mean, you can see that the product model doesn't really fit the way we think of education today. The way we think of education today is that the student is a significant participant in the learning process, as opposed to, it's the old metaphor of, we have this sort of pitcher of knowledge and we're going to pour it into the heads, the cup that is the student. And they don't, their job is just to sit and receive it. Well, that's the old model. We don't think of it that way today. So this product model reigned supreme until the mid-60s. And so, why? Why did this happen? What led to the product model slowly being set aside for the process model? Well, there were a few reasons. One reason is that all of the soldiers came back from World War II and they got the GI Bill. And when they came home, they wanted to go to college. And this, honestly, was a turning point in American culture because previous to World War II, a very small percentage of a very particular group of people got to go to college. There were people who were already upper middle class and wealthy went to college. Everybody else just went out and got usually decent working class jobs. But after World War II, a growing percentage of people, first men and then very soon after women, wanted to go to college. The problem is that many of them were not coming from the most supportive environments, and they did not enter college with the same level of background that people have been going to college for centuries, right? Because if college only existed for people who were already privileged, these were people who had the very best schools, the very best resources, grew up in the most supportive environments, and they just had a huge head start going to college. A lot of these soldiers after World War II went to college and they just didn't have the same level of preparedness. And so that was one phenomenon. Another phenomenon happened in New York. The City University of New York had previously had closed enrollment, meaning you had to apply and reach a certain level to be admitted and to enroll to school. But in 1969, they created open enrollment. What that meant is that they lowered the entry standards and anybody who met them could enroll in school. And a flood of people came in and the school just didn't know how to teach them. They were not prepared. They did not have all of those advantages that college students had previously had. And the writing instruction just didn't know how to deal with these people who didn't have all of those advantages. People who didn't have mastery of, formal essay writing. And so what happened is that over time, a group of writing teachers began to think, maybe the way we're doing it doesn't quite work the same way. And they started doing research into what worked, what didn't work. They started looking across the ocean to see what others were doing, and to our surprise, we thought we were modeling ourselves after the British mode of college instruction, but England had actually moved on and moved out of the old product model. And so the process model began to develop in the 70s. And what this meant was that students were seen as engaging, when they wrote, students were seen as engaging in a personal interaction with the world. And the student was taken seriously. And the idea that you didn't just jump from point A to point B, you didn't like teleport from being given the assignment to turning it in, you had this whole process to do in the middle. And if the teachers got involved in that whole process in the middle, we could really help those students along to being much more successful writers. One of the fathers of writing process theory said, unless we can somehow introduce students to the dynamics of creation, we too simply discourage their hopes of ever writing at all. Meaning, if the student's not involved in saying something that matters to them, if they don't have some ownership of this, if they don't see that they are also creators of ideas, then they're not going to participate. Some guy who's the first person to go to college after generations of blue-collar workers, he shows up and he gets told, you don't have anything to say. You just follow this old mode of writing developed by people that you're nothing like, and and that's how you get to be good at it. Well, guess what? These new students didn't respond to that. And so the process model began to take over, starting in the 80s. And by the 90s, we got to a point where the process model was established as the way of doing it. So what is the process model? So let's talk about it. I know you've heard a lot of this before, but let's go over what the process model is. So the process model is a set of steps. It's how many steps, you'll see different versions of the process model, but overall, there are, these are the steps that are generally seen as the most important. Pre-writing, drafting, revising, editing, and publishing. So notice pre-writing means there's work to be done before you get to the writing. If we are going to say the students bring their own ideas to the table, it helps if they bring some ideas to the table. Where do those come from? Well, that's what we do before they sit down to actually start doing the writing of that task. We help them generate ideas. We help them plan. We help them do focused research. Why? The assumption is that the students know more than they think they know, that they have plenty to write about. But sometimes they have to discover that they know this. And even if they don't have the facts to write about, the idea that they have interests connected to it, that they have attitudes or values that are connected to those ideas, so that when they learn the ideas, they are bringing those values, those ideas, that background to what they're writing about. Well, they have to bring that to the front, because a lot of times if you ask a student to write about a topic, they'll say, well, I don't know what to say. But if you sit down and interview them about it, they'll realize they have plenty to say. All right, so that's pre-writing. It's the generating of ideas and information to write about. But then you get to the drafting. Now, notice we said drafting, not writing, because in the drafting stage, the assumption is that when we're drafting, we're doing a version that we know is not going to be the complete version. It's not a finished product. We're trying to get at and discover what we think. And that's one of the keys to drafting. We often don't really know what we think about something until we talk about it to other people. Think about how many times you've had a really good idea in your head and you think it's a really good idea. And the moment you open your mouth and start telling somebody about it, you realize how dumb an idea it is. We often don't know what we think, really, until we're communicating it to somebody else, and that's what drafting is. And so we're discovering in the process of writing, which is why the third element of the writing process is revising. And revising is considered by most writers and writing teachers the most important part of the writing process. Because with revising, we want to be looking at the larger global issues. We're not looking at sentence level stuff. Revising isn't commas. Revising is, do I have, do my ideas flow here? Are they in the right order? Do I need more specificity? Do I need examples here? During the revising stage, this is where we try to get some peer feedback through peer revision, with conferences with the teacher. And why do we do that? Because, once again, we think we got a great idea until somebody says, well, have you thought about this? And we think, oh, I didn't think about that. That sort of blows a lot of what I said out of the water. Right? So that's why the revising stage is all about change. After revising, we get editing. And the reason why I have editing is because editing is not the same as revising. Revising is content. Editing are commas and sentences. And so even though writing needs to be primarily about content and not about style, eventually style helps. And style is both the felicity, the beauty of how you say something, but it's also just the standard use of the language. And finally, publishing, meaning delivering it to somebody as a product. That's the final stage. And why do we publish? We publish because the writer needs to remember that there is a purpose. And the purpose, when the writer knows that they're writing with a purpose, they write more seriously. There are more stakes involved. So philosophically, the process model is the opposite of the product model, because in the process model, the idea is that the student knows plenty at the beginning of the process, whether what they know is facts or whether it's their own set of values or their own backgrounds. They're bringing a lot to this content that they are going to interpret and present in a very particular way. That's one major difference. The second major difference is that the teacher should be intervening, provoking, interjecting him or herself into the student's writing process during the writing, getting them to reconsider, adding more research, or getting some peer interaction going, getting them to rethink what they're doing in the middle of doing it. The teacher intervenes and thereby improves. Instead of just saying, here's an assignment and let me know when it's done, I'll correct it for you. It's, here's an assignment, and then here are a bunch of supports to help you improve it as much as possible. All right, the third significant difference is that effective writing comes from exploration. Rather than just following a really established model, the idea is that for most students, writing comes from letting it all out and then tightening it up. Explore. Let those ideas take you where they want to take you. Get as much out as possible, and then figure out a way to make it a coherent, powerful statement to other people. And then finally, from the teacher's perspective, the most important way that it is opposite is that philosophically, the attention is more on the process than on the finished product. Meaning, at its best, the process itself will get a grade, not just the product. Yeah, we got to grade the final product. And there are reasons for that, both internal to the class and external social reasons why we have to grade products. However, we want to focus on the process because the process is where there is growth. So there are some downsides to the writing process and the writing process theory. And so what are some of those critiques? And this may be where we get to your own experience. Writing process theorists for a long time were too confident in the universality of this idea. Everybody should follow the writing process. And the problem is that individuals are as different as they can be, as snowflakes, and people are going to create very different processes. People are going to uh, pre-write in radically different ways, and so uh, you know the, it's fine to teach students the writing process, but to demand that all students, even successful writers, follow it in the good old-fashioned standard way is a little oppressive. If the writing process is supposed to be about exploration, are we then going to confine them to a very particular writing process once they start to be adequate writers? Shouldn't we let them explore their own writing process, which means maybe not doing the traditional approach? Secondly, um, writing is public, it's interpretive, and it's situated in particular contexts. And so uh, the writing process, as conceived by the early theorists, was completely individual. But in truth, very little writing that most people do is that completely individual. It's a negotiation of the individual and the outside world. And the writing process early on, and for the first maybe 15 or 20 years of its teaching, was not uh, didn't want to acknowledge the importance of the outside world. Third, a critique is that the theory is a bit too romantic. The writer is this creator genius, separate from those around them. Writing is internal. And that's significantly true, but it's not entirely true. Writers are always a part of their world and their particular environments. Here's an example. You take a student who comes in, and let's say it's an African American student, and they speak African American vernacular. And they're not very good at standard English, and we'll talk about correct English later. There's no such thing as correct English. Standard English. They're not very good at standard English. Well, they are situated in a very particular spot. And the writing process needs to acknowledge that a student is coming from that spot, and also acknowledge that a student who doesn't expand outside of their very particular spot is going to be limited in the world. We want to honor and respect a person's background, and so a person who speaks African American vernacular ought to have opportunities to express themselves in the vernacular that they know so well. But standard English is the code to success, and we want to make sure they're also capable of working in that code. It's called code switching, and it's just a really important skill for basically everybody in the 21st century. All right, so let's see, anything else I want to cover? Oh, the last sort of critique of the writing process that I want to mention is the role of technology. People are the thinking, the way people process information is so determined by technology now that when people sit down to write, nobody goes through the traditional writing process when they're writing on their computer or whatever their word processor is. Because, let's say I've got an idea, I decide I'm going to go ahead and write the introduction first. Well, I'm probably going to rewrite the introduction 4 or 5 times. I may only write the 5th paragraph 1.5 times. But as I write the 5th paragraph, I realize the introductory paragraph doesn't work, so I go back to it. So some things are going to get a lot of revision, some things are going to get only a little bit of revision, and technology, often encourages us to draft and revise and edit all 3 at one point at the sentence level as we're writing, because we're given so much help in doing so. So, a teacher who doesn't acknowledge technology in the way writing works is also, I think, not paying attention to where the writing process should have evolved by today. All right, so I hope that gives you a pretty good sort of background about what the writing process was and is and what some of the concerns are. It's still very, very useful. Um, it's still the way to get most students to produce their best work. And the research that supports that is voluminous. So let me know if you have any questions and if I've left anything out that would be helpful in this video. All right, talk to me and let me know how it's going. All right.